Good morning, everyone. Today we're honored to host Michael DeAngelo, an Africa analyst for the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. DeAngelo focuses on political and security developments in the Horn of Africa and West Africa with an emphasis on maritime strategy. He holds a master's in public and international affairs and a certificate in African studies from the University of Pittsburgh and a BA in history from St. Michael's College, where he was also a Boren Fellow in Senegal. Please join me in welcoming Michael DeAngelo as he speaks on the Horn of Africa.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, yeah, it's a pleasure. It's an honor to have you. To begin with, could you briefly explain what we mean by the Horn of Africa, what countries it includes, and why is the region so strategically important today?
Yes, so when we're talking about the Horn of Africa, it's quite literally the Horn, the place that juts out in Eastern Africa. So for the purposes of this conversation, we can just say that we'll include Ethiopia in there, Sudan as well. Sudan's right on the Red Sea, of course. Djibouti, Eritrea, Somalia, and then also some would argue potentially that Egypt is included in there as well. So in terms of why it's so strategically significant is, of course, you have a key waterway there. You have the Red Sea, and of course the Suez Canal. So you have a bunch of global trade moving through there. But also too, it's the Horn of Africa. I don't think that it's like helpful to think about it as just being in Africa. It's really part of the broader Red Sea region. It's just the western part of the Red Sea region. So it's really interconnected with the Middle East as well, especially with the Gulf countries, which we're going to talk about a lot. So any developments there also impact the Horn, and any developments in the Horn impact the Middle East as well.
Okay, to start off with, can you map out for us the overall structure of alliances in the Horn currently, the key groups of these countries, and which size do major players like Turkey, Egypt, Israel, US, the UAE, and Saudi fall in this map?
Yeah, of course. So I think that it's helpful to break it down into two axes, basically, or axes. So you have the revisionist axis and then the status quo axis. So when I say revisionist axis, what I'm talking about is basically this is a group of countries and non-state actors as well that aren't necessarily satisfied with the regional order as it is and want to overturn it a bit to better shape to their interests, essentially. So in that, I will include the United Arab Emirates. They're probably the most notable country in that, or the most notable middle power. You have Israel in that as well. Ethiopia is the primary African actor in that, and a very Ethiopia drives a lot of developments that we're seeing in the Horn of Africa right now. I'll include Somaliland in there, the breakaway region of northern Somalia, as well as the other anti-federal government of Somalia states. So when I say that, I'm talking about specifically these are states within Somalia, so Jubaland and Puntland, that are kind of opposed to some of the things, or a lot of the things, so the federal government of Somalia is doing. And I'm not saying that they're going to break away, but there's definitely a risk there because they already do have some functional autonomy. And then when it comes to non-state actors, you have the most noble one being the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, one of the main warring parties in the Sudanese civil war. And then you have a few countries that kind of lean towards the revisionist axis as well, mostly due to their partnerships with mainly the UAE, but also Ethiopia. So I would include South Sudan in that, Chad as well. And then, Kenya also, I would say leans a little bit too. And then we'll go over the status quo actors, or the status quo axis. So with the status quo axis, what I mean by that is these are the countries that prioritize stability over everything else, and they don't want the structure of countries or the structure of governments to change all that dramatically. They want to keep it basically the same, the status quo. So in that we have Egypt, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Eritrea. You also have a few countries that are, I say, more aligned than not. So in that, I would say Somalia, Turkey, Qatar, and Djibouti as well. One thing to note with Turkey, though, and I think this is important to note for all of these actors, is that these two axes or these two blocks, they're not necessarily set in stone. they're somewhat fluid. So within these blocks, different actors have, may have good bilateral relations with one another. So for example, Turkey, even though it's, relatively status quo, has very good ties with Ethiopia, for example. So, it's not that there's no interplay between, these blocks. It's like there actually are, it's like kind of like a web more so than anything. I think it's helpful to split up into axes, but if you do so without acknowledging the fact that there's connections between the different actors, I think you risk oversimplifying it because it's a very complex area.
Okay, I'll pass it on to Caleb, who has the next few questions.
Yeah, sure. So I think we're all here to kind of hear about the US, whether we like it or not. So like if we were to map kind of the US priorities, like country by country in the Horn, what do you think are like the US top interests in each one? And where are like some of the biggest policy contradictions or kind of like gray areas?
Yeah, of course. And I forgot to include the US in the overall structure of alliances there. What I would say for the US is the US finds itself basically right in the middle of it all. So they have good, relatively strong ties with countries in both of those categories. And we don't lean one way or another. Or maybe on specific issues, we lean one way or another, but cumulatively, we're basically in the middle. So in terms of US priorities country by country, I'll start with Somalia because that's probably the one with the most, I guess, the most direct, the most direct connection to U.S. interests. And with Somalia, it's all about counterterrorism, of course. So within Somalia, you have two very active Salafi jihadi groups, or we could call them, violent Islamic extremist groups. So we have Al-Shabaab, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia. So Al-Shabaab, their goal is to essentially overthrow the federal government of Somalia and institute Islamist rule throughout all of Somalia. And the thing, a lot of Salafi jihadi groups have this goal in other countries as well. But what makes Al-Shabaab pretty notable is that they actually control significant swaths of territory, especially in southern Somalia, and they govern it as well. And are seen as, they have a pretty squared away governance structure. They're very organized. And, some people would say that, the governance they provide is more effective than the Somali federal government, which has been a serious issue that the Somali federal government has not addressed yet. So anyway, Al-Shabaab, not only do they have that, but they're also Al-Qaeda's most profitable branch globally. They make the most money. And also, they have been implicated in kind of transnational attack plots, including ones directed towards the U.S. There was a kind of like a 9/11 style plot that us and I think it was the Philippines foiled that originated from Al-Shabaab as well. So that's our main, interests in Somalia. Regarding the other Salafi jihadi group, the Islamic State in Somalia, they're not nearly as big as Al-Shabaab, and they're also very contained to Puntland region in northern Somalia. But the thing that makes the Islamic State in Somalia something that we're very focused on and that we're very involved with fighting is the fact that they play a really key role in the Islamic State's global network. So what IS Somalia is, think of it, they're almost like middlemen in a way. So they facilitate money, they facilitate, just operations to all the other, branches in the Islamic State network, especially those in Africa as well. So that's why we've really prioritized fighting back against the Islamic State in Somalia. And there's also been, rumors, some intelligence agencies have said that the former head of the Islamic State in Somalia is the head of IS globally as well. So it just shows you it's kind of punches above its weight in terms of, significance to their global network. So that's Somalia. Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa by population. It's also the economic and security anchor within the Horn of Africa. So, naturally, I think, the U.S., has a vested interest in assuring that, we have strong influence within Ethiopia. Going down to Sudan, the key interest there for the U.S. is stability, especially with the civil war going on. The civil war is, not good for anyone, of course, especially the Sudanese people. And, so no, we're not gaining anything from that, and we want to stop. So we're looking for stability in Sudan. We're looking for a government that does not, let's say, allow Islamist influence to kind of seep in like past Sudanese governments have. If we can all go back to the 90s when the Sudanese government harbored Osama bin Laden, actually. So, it's like those influences are still there. And then also we want to limit the influence of Russia and Iran because both have shown an interest in kind of gaining a foothold on the Red Sea through Sudan. So that's a priority for us there. Djibouti, we have a big military base there. I think it's our biggest base in all of Africa. So the key thing there is to just maintain our military presence. It supports operations. And this goes back to the point of the Horn of Africa being part of the broader Red Sea region. The base in Djibouti supports operations, not just in the Horn of Africa for us, but across the whole Red Sea region, including into the Middle East. So that's why Djibouti is key. And also China has a big presence there. So, we want to counter that any way that we can. And lastly, Eritrea. Eritrea, we do not have good ties with Eritrea. So I think our interest in Eritrea, we have limited influence there in terms of how to, shaping things. So I think we just want to make sure that, that we contain any conflict between them and Ethiopia and that it doesn't spill over. We try to prevent it if possible. Now, I like the question about contradictions. That's an important one. It's a difficult one too. So going to Somalia, I think one of the contradictions in Somalia is that I would say the most effective governing body within Somalia is Somaliland. But at the same time, we work with Somaliland. We have ties with Somaliland, not official diplomatic ties per se. We don't recognize them as an independent state, but we do have ties with Somaliland. But at the same time, we're very reluctant to say recognize them as an independent state or expand ties in meaningful ways because we don't want to anger this federal government of Somalia because they're a key counterterrorism partner for us. But at the same time, the federal government of Somalia has severe governance shortcomings.
Right.
And, the way the situation is right now between the relations between federal government of Somalia, the Somali opposition, and Jubaland and Puntland, we don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know, how they're going to be able to resolve these political disputes that are quite existential. So that's a key contradiction there, is that we have to try to balance that relationship, even though Somaliland is probably the most logical partner for us in terms of, just being an effective government. I would say another contradiction perhaps would be with Ethiopia. With Ethiopia, we want Ethiopia to be an economic and security anchor in the Horn of Africa. We want them to be a stabilizing force. But that being said, Ethiopia's claims to, say, the port of Assab in Eritrea, they're kind of, it seems like their desire to get access to the sea by any means necessary, including force, which they have not fully ruled out. That's a contradiction there that we have to address because it's not in our interest for a war like that to break out. And then let me see, going down the list here. Yeah, I would say those are the two biggest ones. With Sudan, one thing I'll add in with there is we will not tolerate a rapid support forces led government. I think we've made that pretty clear. But at the same time, we have concerns with the Sudanese armed forces. We're not willing to throw our weight behind them fully. And we're really concerned about the potential, Islamist influences within the SAF-led government. So that's a little bit of a contradiction there in terms, how are we going to square that? But I think that out of any of the others, I think we've done a pretty good job of, conveying our concerns to the SAF. And the SAF has taken at least symbolic steps to, try to tamper down the influence of the Islamists. Whether it's been effective or not, that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, I have one like quick follow-up just because I'm
Yeah.
interested, and then we'll move on to kind of the next big question. But you talked about how Al-Shabaab is like the most profitable enterprise for like the broader Al-Qaeda network.
Yep.
Why do you think it is? Or, like, how do they make all their money?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So a lot of Al-Shabaab's profitability comes in the fact of how much they just control so much territory, or at least have a lot of influence in a lot of territories. So what they're able to do is they've established a very effective taxation system. So goods that move through the areas that they're present in, they tax those goods. So they're making a profit of a lot of the trade in Somalia, even in Mogadishu as well. I've read reports that people in the markets of Mogadishu often have to pay two taxes, one to the federal government of Somalia and then one to Al-Shabaab. It's kind of like a parallel governance system almost, even in Mogadishu. So that's how Al-Shabaab, makes a lot of their money. Yeah.
Got it. Perfect. All right, and then moving on to kind of our next like big question. I'm sure you read like the national security strategy, which like barely kind of mentions Africa at all.
Yeah, I was gonna say it wasn't very hard to read. It didn't take much time.
Yeah, focus on domestic issues.
Yeah.
And so like that vacuum we think is being filled by like Turkey, Iran, China, and other actors. And like in the absence of kind of the US lead, like is the Israel or the UAE effectively becoming like the primary Western aligned security guarantor in the Horn?
That's an interesting question. I don't know how helpful it is to view Israel and the UAE as Western aligned regarding the Horn of Africa specifically. I think that both, going back to the whole revisionist and status quo axes, both have some, I guess, pro-Western views, if you will.
Right.
Like we have decent ties with countries on both sides of the aisle there. So I think that we should be reviewing Israel and the UAE as, revisionist first and foremost. So they are undermining the regional order. Now, some people may argue that the way in which they're undermining it is a good thing. In some cases, some might argue it's bad. I think a lot of people, myself included, would say that there's, characteristics of both in it. But at the end of the day, it is inherently destabilizing what they're doing. And then, going to the RSF specifically, and, Israel's not really included in this, but going with the UAE, because the UAE is the indispensable backer of the RSF in Sudan. RSF rule in Sudan, or the RSF, quote unquote, winning the war, that's not in the US's interests.
Yeah.
And going to Ethiopia, who UAE and Israel both have very strong ties with, allowing Ethiopia to have its way and get a port by any means necessary, and by keeping the threat of force on the table, that's not necessarily in our interests either. So what I'm saying here is that this revisionist axis is not necessarily more Western aligned than the status quo axis, because we have very strong ties with Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And then also Turkey is, a NATO partner of ours. So we have good ties on both sides of the aisle. So I think that the key thing for the US and how we can, I don't expect the US to be able to match the investments. I don't even think the US should try to match the investments that, say, the UAE has made in the Horn of Africa. It's their backyard. It's not ours. We have other areas of priority. But how we should maximize our influence is we can use our relationships on both sides with both axes and really play the role of like an independent arbiter or an arbitrator, and kind of, mediate things. So I think that's kind of one overarching policy recommendation out.
Yeah. And do you think that like the Trump administration right now has any incentive to do that? I mean, I was thinking like in terms of something like Venezuela, where we were just interested in the oil, there is a lot of like natural resources in the region, and China runs like very profitable like oil operations. But besides like a financial incentive, is there any signs from like the Trump administration that they're interested in kind of like arbitrating in the region.
Yes, there have been. And this goes with the Trump administration's Africa policy overall, which, you know, if you read the national security strategy, I think the section on Africa, I think it's 3 paragraphs, maybe. Which, you know, they very clearly define what they say the US's interests in Africa are. So, you know, at least that's very clearly defined. But there's kind of a lack of an overarching framework with which the U.S. can address Africa, and then also the Horn of Africa as well. So, yes, to answer your question, the U.S. does have an incentive and actually has gotten involved. We're leading the peace talks in Sudan, or I shouldn't even say peace talks because there haven't really been any peace talks. We're leading the Quad dialogue between, you know, it's us, and then it's also the key backers of both the SAF and the RSF. So it's us, the UAE, who's obviously with the RSF, and then Saudi Arabia and Egypt, who side with the SAF. So we're leading that dialogue to try to, you know, limit the external backing of the RSF and the SAF and try to, you know, bring that war to somewhat of a conclusion. And then also, Trump recently sent a letter to, I believe, it was more of just an open letter, I think, but it basically declared his willingness to negotiate or to facilitate negotiations between Egypt and Ethiopia regarding the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. That's become a key point of contention between the two. Egypt is very worried that the GERD, that's what the dam is called, that the GERD is going to, you know, impact their water access or threaten their water access. They view it quite existentially, and it's really soured relations between the two. So, you know, that being said, yes, the U.S. is involved, but I think it's more of a piecemeal approach. So Trump sees Sudan, he's like, okay, I can end a war. And Trump sees, you know, the GERD, and he's like, okay, maybe I can prevent a war, or not saying there would be a war between the two. Maybe I can, you know, limit tensions here. But I don't think there's much of
less of like a framework.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Not as much of an
It's more just like picking and choosing.
Yeah, exactly. Which some might say that that's, you know, maybe that's more effective. I would still like to see more of a overarching.
Yeah. I guess it's like kind of that central question that's come up of like U.S. interests versus like U.S. being like a global like actor.
Right. And I think a key point of contention between, say, I would say that maybe traditional, and it's not just Republicans, but also, you know, Democrats as well, more kind of globally minded Democrats. And then the Trump wing of the Republican Party, which is most of it now, is that, you know, that old wing sees the U.S. being involved globally as its interest, whereas the Trump administration doesn't necessarily see it that way. It's much more narrowly defined.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Let's move on to the next question. After Israel's formal recognition of Somaliland, what immediate shifts do you expect in Red Sea politics? And in terms of like shipping security, Gulf alignment, and like, you know, those status quo versus revisionist blocks?
Yes, this is a very tricky question. It's such a flashpoint right now. Basically, Israel's recognition of Somalia was essentially universally condemned by every country in Africa, every country in the Middle East, China as well. That being said, a few countries were notably silent on it. Now, the UAE is very likely helped facilitate Israel's recognition of Somaliland. Ethiopia has stayed silent on it because Ethiopia has very strong ties with Somaliland, and we can get more into that if you want to. So anyway, there are some key actors within that, you know, revisionist axis that seem to be aligned with Israel's recognition of Somaliland as well. That being said, I don't necessarily know if I wouldn't necessarily say that there's anything in the immediate pipeline in terms of other countries like the UAE or Ethiopia or the US. I think those would be the 3 most likely ones to recognize Somalia. I don't think anything's in the immediate pipeline. But that being said, I think the UAE would be the most likely out of those three countries to be the next one to recognize Somaliland, because its relationship with the federal government of Somalia is severely strained right now. The federal government of Somalia just canceled. It was, I think, it was about a month ago. Canceled all bilateral agreements with the UAE when the UAE was a key backer of Somalia, the federal government of Somalia, for a while. But yeah, so that relationship is very strained over a variety of reasons, including Somaliland, but also things related to the conflict in Yemen as well. That was like the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. So anyway, if the UAE doesn't have much of a relationship with the federal government of Somalia now, they might just go all in with Somaliland.
Yeah.
And, you know, see no harm in recognizing.
And there's also like, you know, they could gain a security foothold if they were able to establish like a base or something in
they actually have a base in Somaliland. They have a base in Puntland as well. But under the federal government of Somalia's kind of dictate and to cancel all bilateral agreements, technically the UAE has to vacate those bases. It seems like they've partially vacated, at least in Puntland. Somaliland is a little less clear, and an Emirati-linked company operates the port of Berbera, in Somaliland, and they've said that they're not going to leave, and that operation. So we'll see what happens there. So that's from the UAE side of things. Now, in terms of what Israel gets out of the recognition of Somaliland, since they've recognized, key officials within Israel and Somaliland have met and have, kind of upgraded their cooperation on multiple things, including security as well. Israel's security interest in Somaliland is very tied in with what's going on in Yemen with the Houthis. The Houthis have, are significant, pose significant opposition to Israel's actions in the Middle East. So, Israel gaining a security foothold in Somaliland would allow them to more effectively combat the Houthis.
Because they could launch like out of Navy out of Somaliland. There.
Yeah.
And,
or, perhaps it's not a question of them setting up a base, although I think, potentially they have that in mind. Maybe it's more so just, enabling Somaliland to keep a closer eye on the Houthis.
Or like funding some Somaliland security operation.
Yeah, exactly. But if Israel were to set up a base, now that would be something that would, that would become a real flashpoint, because one, Al-Shabaab has already said that, they will target it. Their capability to do so is a little unclear. I think they'd have some significant difficulties because they're not nearly as present in northern Somalia as they are in southern and central Somalia. But the bigger issue there is that Turkey has said, Turkey and Egypt as well, and Saudi Arabia, they're basically saying that any effort to do something like this, like the recognition alone, was a violation of Somalia's sovereignty. The presence of foreign forces in Somalia, and they view Somaliland as part of Somalia, that would be an even bigger violation of Somalia's sovereignty. And Turkey actually recently deployed F-16s to Somalia as well. So, you have
they definitely have like the military capability. If Israel was to try to build a base, Turkey could probably get rid of it very quickly.
Yeah, like whether that like they would come to blows like that. I think that would be that's pretty unlikely, and especially I think we could mediate that very easily because of our ties. Not easily, but we would be in a very good position to mediate that because of our ties with Israel and then our ties with Turkey as well. But it's clear that Turkey's trying to deter Israel from expanding its presence or gaining a foothold in Somaliland. Now, regarding say the U.S. or Ethiopia or other countries recognizing Somaliland, I think a lot of it actually hinges on Somalia's internal politics as well. Specifically regarding the U.S., as I said before, is reluctant to, and one of the contradictions that we were talking about, is reluctant to recognize Somaliland because it doesn't want to spoil its relationship with the federal government of Somalia. But the federal government of Somalia has elections upcoming, planned elections in 2026, that it's going to be very hard for them to carry out due to the, there's constitutional and like the structure of the election. There's debates over that, full-on disputes between the Somali federal government and then the opposition in Jubaland and Puntland states. So if they're unable to reconcile that and the elections fail and there's violence, which there has been in the past in Somalia around elections, the U.S. might say the federal government of Somalia is not an effective partner.
Right.
And Trump has called them out already.
Yeah.
And the U.S. might say, what are we gaining out of continuing this partnership with federal government of Somalia over recognizing,
right.
An entity that is, a bit more stable and effective in terms of governance.
Because it could become a question of like, well, if we're trying to do counterterrorism operations in Somalia, but the Somali federal government is so weak that they're basically letting terror flourish, it's kind of like, a zero-sum game.
Yeah, I just think at some point it becomes a question of, is it worth it for us to keep our, engagement with the federal government with Somalia at the expense of,
right,
maybe establishing more partnership. And Somaliland has, offered us mineral access, port access as well. So Trump has, interestingly enough, seemed pretty uninterested in that publicly, which is, not really fitting with the MO of the Trump administration. Those are the things that normally would interest the administration. So, we'll see if that progresses at all.
And where do you think like the line would tip if that was you in that situation? Like for where you would just decide, Somaliland is like clearly the better option. And
I would say if it gets to a point where there's a protracted constitutional crisis between the federal government of Somalia and then, the opposition in Jubaland and Puntland, where there's a protracted crisis where elections aren't happening, they're fighting each other, and the focus is completely off of, I'm not saying a full-on civil war, although that, in theory, that could happen. But a protracted crisis, I just don't think that there would be much bandwidth to carry out effective CT anymore. So I think perhaps that would be the line.
Awesome. Well, I have to head out and deal with some family stuff, but it was very nice to talk to you.
Yeah, you as well.
And I'll follow up on our conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
And then
feel free to reach out.
I'll leave it to Atan for the rest of the questions.
Great.
Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Bye.
Well, thank you for the overview on kind of the foreign relations with countries in the Horn. Moving on to more conflict in the Horn itself, relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea have kind of soared since the Pretoria Agreement, with Ethiopia recently notifying the UN that Eritrea is preparing for war. How likely is a direct interstate conflict between the two countries?
I think it's more likely than not. Now, the scale of such a conflict is unclear. But as of right now, all the indicators are basically blinking red. So you have, mobilizations. Ethiopia is mobilizing forces, especially towards the north, towards Tigray region in the north. And we can get into the dynamics there a bit. The rhetoric is obviously, whether it's over Tigray or over Ethiopia wanting access to, Eritrean ports or access to the sea through Eritrea. The rhetoric is there as well. That's not a good indicator. And then Eritrea is aligned with the TPLF. So that's the basically the leading political force, political group, and military group within Tigray region, which is a kind of a semi-autonomous region of Ethiopia, I guess you can say. So you have Eritrea aligning with the TPLF, and then also with Amhara insurgents. Amhara is the region between the Ethiopian capital and Tigray, so it's still in northern Ethiopia. People. Yep, exactly. So you have some insurgent forces in the Amhara region that are waging a pretty expanding insurgency against the Ethiopian federal government. So Eritrea is aligning with both of those groups. So that's also a clear red flag as well. Ethiopia has called them out for doing so. And then you have Tigray as being kind of like the flashpoint that could really set everything off. And you're seeing that right now. I mean, in theory, it could happen any day now, because what you've had recently is fighting between Ethiopian federal government forces and Tigrayan forces in Tigray. There's been a lack of implementation of the Pretoria peace agreement that ended the war, the Tigray war in 2022. And, these kind of outstanding tensions and issues are really coming to a head now. And unfortunately, it seems like a conflict, a large scale conflict is likely to break out there. Perhaps not imminently, but with the mobilizations, with the lack of dialogue between the two parties, unfortunately, it seems like it's likely to break out there. And if that does happen, Eritrea is very likely to be involved on the side of the TPLF, which is kind of ironic because Eritrea fought against the TPLF with the Ethiopian federal government in the first Tigray war in 2022. But then there's been some realignment, mostly due to Eritrea and Ethiopian relations plummeting. So because of that broader realignment, Eritrean troops are also present in Tigray as well. And at first, after the Pretoria Agreement, they were required to withdraw. They just never did. Now they're there. It's seemingly with the approval of the TPLF. So just their presence and being there, there would likely be some sort of fighting between the Eritrea and Ethiopia.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that a lot of this conflict is driven by the fact that Ethiopia doesn't have a port and are basically losing millions of dollars every day due to the fact that they don't have a port. Do you foresee any other conflict related to these port-related troubles of Ethiopia?
Yeah, so I think that the issue in Tigray, perhaps it could spark off a broader conflict that then ties in, the port issue with that. So, perhaps if there's, once a conflict starts between the two forces, all bets are off essentially. Yep. And what you actually had a situation in, it was March of 2025, in which the Eritreans mobilized and the Ethiopians mobilized forces, not at their border in Tigray region, but in their border in Afar region, which is the region that it basically is right near Eritrea's port of Assab, basically. So if you cross over the border from Afar region into Eritrea, you reach, the port of Assab. So that was pretty unrelated to Tigray. That was just an issue of port access there. So perhaps, the war, a conflict in Tigray could set off a broader chain of events that would lead to, a war over port access as well. Or it could be set off. It could be set off separately as well. But I think Tigray is the most likely flashpoint that could then spiral out of control. Again, once it starts, all bets are off. It could expand drastically and pull in some of the middle powers as well.
Yeah. I mean, an unrelated question relating to this as well. Ethiopia also shares border disputes with Somalia as well. Does this tie into any other major problems that could arise as well, or is it kind of on the down low right now?
Yeah, so with Ethiopia and Somalia, the key source of tensions there is over Somaliland, essentially. So Ethiopia has a complicated relationship with the federal government of Somalia. On one hand, Ethiopia provides very vital counterterrorism support against Al-Shabaab in southern Somalia. Ethiopia is basically trying to build a buffer zone between, its eastern border. I guess it would be its southeastern border, and then, Jubaland and southwest states in Somalia. And what you've seen is Al-Shabaab has actually, infiltrated that border and conducted attacks within Ethiopia before. So that's Ethiopia's interest there. Ethiopia has, strong ties with the federal government of Somalia when it comes to fighting Al-Shabaab. Now, the complicated part comes in where Ethiopia, in their quest for sea access, was looking to gain access to the Somaliland's port of Berbera. And there was a memorandum of understanding signed between Ethiopia and Somaliland, where it seems like Ethiopia would have likely recognized Somaliland in exchange for, rights over,
Port?
at least some of that port. Yep,
Yeah.
the port of Berbera. So Somalia viewed that as a violation of its sovereignty, and that kind of spoiled relations with them. Turkey was able to step in and mediate a resolution in which Somalia and Ethiopia would work together to, provide Ethiopia access to the sea at another location within Somalia. But those talks have essentially gone nowhere. So it was really just a band-aid, essentially. Those key the root causes are still there, and that's just Ethiopia's desire for sea access. So that's why Somalia leans towards the status quo axis for sure.
Moving on to Somaliland, I mean, Somaliland is kind of a proven model of dysfunctional sovereignty, and although they're fighting for kind of recognition from other countries, they've worked pretty well as a country compared to Somalia with its problems with Al-Shabaab and terrorism. Do you think their model of dysfunctional sovereignty could become like a template for other regions like Puntland in Somalia itself?
It could. I think Puntland and Jubaland both seemingly are more interested in staying a part of Somalia, but just ensuring that their semi autonomy is protected, and also their influence over the electoral system and the constitutional process. A lot of that ties in with clan-based politics. We don't need to get into that. But essentially, Jubaland and Puntland are seemingly more interested in carving out a good amount of influence for themselves within the federal government of Somalia's structure, not necessarily splitting away. Now, that being said, they're using the threat of splitting away, or the potential for them splitting away, as leverage, in their discussions with the federal government of Somalia. So if talks fail over resolving the sources of the election disputes and the other constitutional disputes, perhaps Somaliland could become a template for Puntland and Jubaland. One thing that's interesting is, since 2023, you've seen both Puntland and Jubaland assert more autonomy, both symbolically and literally as well. Puntland withdrew its representatives to Somalia's parliament, and it's announced that it's going to conduct its affairs like an independent state. Jubaland changed its constitution to remove the phrase that it was a federal member state to it just being a state now. So these are legitimate changes, and not necessarily declarations of intentions to do what Somaliland did, but it's on the table. One thing that the federal government of Somalia did recently, which was interesting, was they inaugurated a new federal member state in disputed territory between Somaliland and Puntland, and it's called Northeastern State. So the federal government of Somalia is essentially supporting the establishment or the inauguration of Northeastern State to ensure that it has a foothold in northern Somalia to perhaps prevent Puntland from doing something like that.
Yeah. I mean, with Somaliland increasing in terms of popularity with like countries like Israel and India also like recognizing it, and with other kind of self-governing or self-sovereignty, functional sovereignty parts, so like Puntland and Jubaland kind of separating, and with the increase in power of Al-Shabaab in Somalia, do you think there lies any scenario where the federal government of Somalia ceases to exist?
I think that I don't necessarily think that I don't think it's likely that the federal government of Somalia will completely collapse and that, you know, Somalia basically won't be a country that'll be a bunch of split up, entities. I don't think that scenario is likely. That being said, though, there is a risk of the federal government of Somalia basically becoming not functional outside of Mogadishu. I mean, some might argue that's already not very functional outside of Mogadishu and a few other population centers, but like really not having, much authority and presence outside of Mogadishu. That's certainly a possibility if it's unable to resolve these political disputes between, the Somali opposition along with Jubaland and Puntland. They've formed a coalition actually altogether. So it's like Somali opposition, which consists of former Somali presidents as well, and Jubaland and Puntland. They've formed this thing called the Somali Future Council, and it's just an anti-federal government Somalia political coalition that's opposing the federal government of Somalia's election reforms, as well as some other constitutional reforms as well. So with that kind of unified coalition against the federal government of Somalia, if they're unable to, hammer out an agreement on how they're going to hold these elections and how they're going to draft a permanent constitution with the federal government of Somalia, again, at that point, all bets are off. With these hot button political issues in Somalia, oftentimes, you will see mobilization of forces, against one another, whether it's between states or within states, clan versus clan, etc. So those cleavages definitely exist. And if the federal government of Somalia is unable to resolve this dispute with the Somali Future Council, I think it's at that point likely that you will see the federal government of Somalia be very challenged in exerting influence outside of the Banadir region and maybe a few other areas.
Yeah. I mean, if this was to happen, do you foresee the United States and Ethiopia kind of coming in and saving the federal government?
I think that the U.S., I think would, try to mediate between the two. I think that Ethiopia is basically hedging its bets right now. So obviously it still has somewhat a counterterrorism cooperation with the federal government of Somalia, although it also works very closely with Jubaland state forces in these counterterrorism operations as well. But, there is some cooperation there. So Ethiopia has those relations with the Somali federal government. But at the same time, it's hedging its bets in that it also has very strong ties, not only with Jubaland, but also with Puntland and Somaliland as well. So I think that it's positioning itself where in a situation, a protracted crisis, like the one we just talked about, I don't necessarily think Ethiopia would save the federal government of Somalia. I think that Ethiopia is positioning itself to just make sure that its borders are stable and secured no matter what happens.
Okay. Moving on to my final question. If you had to identify, say, a one black swan event that would happen in the Horn of Africa in the remainder of the year, what would it be?
So when we say black swan, we're talking about like a very high impact event that maybe isn't very likely?
Like a catastrophe, basically.
Okay. So I would say a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. And unfortunately, I don't see that as being unlikely, or at least a conflict. Let me rephrase. I think a conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea in 2026 is likely. Whether it progresses to like a full-on interstate war, I don't necessarily know about that. But again, once the conflict starts, all bets are off. It could easily spiral. All of the factors are in place for it to escalate into an interstate war, and that alone would be devastating enough. that would have widespread repercussions, not only within Ethiopia and Eritrea, but then, all the region, all the, the countries around there, they're not well positioned to, take on refugee flows or, to, really secure their own borders and prevent this conflict from spilling over. In a way, they're vulnerable as well. So it would have some severe effects within the Horn of Africa, but also it would likely draw in at least the United Arab Emirates and Egypt. The UAE is a key backer of Ethiopia. They've invested billions of dollars in Ethiopia. They have a very close security relationship, supply drones and other things. UAE was actually a key backer of the Ethiopian federal government during the Tigray War, when the Tigrayans were marching towards the capital, and it seemed like perhaps the Ethiopian federal government might fall. UAE support was pretty important in helping the federal government push back the Tigrayans and force them into peace talks. So you have the UAE, which would likely get involved on the side of Ethiopia, at least in terms of supplying Ethiopian federal government very handily. And then with Egypt, Egypt is just trying to contain Ethiopia's influence at all costs. There's the GERD issue. That's it's existential for them. They've said so. And basically, what Egypt has done is they've formed very close ties with Eritrea, with Somalia, all in efforts to really contain Ethiopia. So I think that you would see Egypt, come in on the side of Eritrea with support. How much they'll be able to provide, that's unclear, given that they're already supporting the SAF in Sudan. Yep. And also they have issues to worry about on their eastern border with, everything that's going on in Gaza and whatnot as well. They are, somewhat, maybe not overstretched, but they have a lot of commitments. But either way, I think the UAE and Egypt would get drawn into that. And, that increases the risk of escalation more. And then you also have, Saudi Arabia as well. Saudi Arabia has pretty good ties with both Ethiopia and Eritrea. So I don't think that it's likely that they would, get involved definitively on one side or another. But again, there is that risk there. And with the fragmentation of the Horn of Africa, Saudi Arabia is leaning towards, they are a status quo actor. They're not leaning towards it. They're a clear status quo actor. And they do not want instability in the region. So you might see more of a willingness for them to, get involved and to settle it.
Yep. With that, I'm going to end the conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Mr. DeAngelo. We don't get too many people speaking on Africa, and I'm really interested in the topic. So this has been really interesting and insightful.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate it a lot. It was a great conversation, and I'm glad you all are, really interested, and, feel free to stay in touch.